Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. There are over 2 million podcasts out there, and 68% of the U.S. population listens to an average of 8 hours of podcast episodes each week. This is a big opportunity for brands to advertise their products. But most small, scrappy marketing teams at technology companies don't know how to get results from a podcast advertising campaign. So that's why I have Heather Osgood on the show. Heather is a podcast advertising specialist and is the founder of True Native Media, a podcast representation agency. In this episode, Heather and I get into what makes podcast advertising so special and how you can get started with your own campaign. When people think about podcast ads, and we get a lot of questions from our customers and just folks that we're typically interacting with, they may think about these ads that you hear that are dynamically inserted, right, into some of their favorite podcasts. But that's not really the full picture, right? So could you maybe start with talking about some of the options that brands do have as far as the types of ads that they can run on podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few different types of ads that you can run on podcasts. And I'll start with kind of the traditional method of podcast advertising, which is a baked in or embedded host-read ad. So I'm sure that if you've been a podcast listener for some time, you have encountered those ads where your host, the host of the show will come on and say, I love ZipRecruiter. It's the best company ever. If you want to hire people, go to ZipRecruiter and use my special promo code, right? So, most of the ads that are in this space are still host-read ads. Not all of them are embedded or baked into an episode, but what that means is that the host is going to release your ad in one specific episode. So let's say they're releasing an episode this Thursday, your ad is going to be in that episode. And so if I listen to this Thursday's episode, I'm going to hear your ad. If I listen to last week's episode, I'm not going to hear your ad. Or if I listen to the following week's episode, I'm not going to hear your ad, because it's just in one specific episode and then it stays in there indefinitely. So unless the producer of the show goes and removes the ad read, it's going to be in there for a very long time. And that's how ads really have gotten started in the podcast space and have been operating for many years in that fashion. So that is a very traditional way of doing ads. And if you wanted to go out and contact a podcaster directly, especially if you're looking at a really maybe niche topic podcast or a show that's talking about something very specific, you could go to that host and say, hey, I want an ad. And more than likely, they're going to run that baked in host-read ad. So that's the first type. The second type, like you mentioned, is the type that's dynamically inserted. And what that means is that the host has gone through all of their episodes. They've put insertion points in their episodes, and then the computer inserts ads into the episode. Now, those can be producer-read ads, those can be host-read ads, and those can also be pre-recorded ads, right? They could be anything you wanted them to be. Still, most dynamic ads are going to be host-read. There's still a lot of those host-read ads that are happening out there. The value of dynamic insertion is it allows you to get in front of the full listening audience. So you would select a time period. So maybe for a 4-week period, let's say your ad is going to run. So it doesn't matter if I listen to episode 1 or episode 100. If I listen within, let's say, the month of September, I'm going to hear your ad because the ad's going to be served to me. So that's one type. And then the last type is what I would put in the category of programmatic. So programmatic uses the dynamic insertion technology, but programmatic is usually purchased on a much larger scale. So large agencies, brands are working with, different essentially trade desks where they go and they say, I don't know what podcast I'm advertising on. And truthfully, I don't care what podcast I'm advertising on. I'm just looking to reach men who are between the ages of 25 and 35 who live in New York City, and can even get down into really minute details. Like, I just want to hit those people and serve them ads on rainy days. So, I mean, there's the technology involved with programmatic is very advanced. Now, I will say that if you're looking to try and use one of these, there are different kind of methods that you would go about to kind of access or use them. And they can all be accessible to, a variety of advertisers. It just depends on what your goals are.
Yeah. Yeah. And Heather, I'm hoping to get into some of that too. Like when you use these certain ads based on your budget or your goals or what have you. And we'll get into that here in a second. The one thing I was hoping to do as well, can you tell me a little bit about like where these ads are positioned? I mean, obviously we hear a lot of ads up front, but I know there are other cases where you'll break away during an episode as well, and then even have ads at the very end. So can you talk about some of those situations too?
Yeah, in terms of kind of placement and even length, placement is typically, like you said, a pre-roll is going to be at the beginning, a mid-roll is going to be somewhere within content, and a post-roll ad will be at the very end. I would say pre-roll and mid-roll ads are the most desired ads, of course. A pre-roll is going to be an ad that really happens the minute that you push play. So if I push play to listen to your podcast, but instead of hearing that show, I hear an ad, that's going to be a true pre-roll ad. And then there's variations in between that pre-roll and that mid-roll of when the ad kind of comes in within content. And in terms of ad lengths, usually you're going to range in the 30 to 60 to maybe even like 90 to 120. Most ads are purchased at like a 30 or a 60 second time, slot. But if they're host read, a lot of times they'll go over that. So it just kind of depends. But ideally, you would love to have your ad be somewhere within the content, because I'm listening to the show because I like the show and I want to hear, the show. And then if all of a sudden I hear an ad, chances are I'm engaged in doing something else, right? I might be exercising or cleaning my house or commuting. So I'm less likely to fast forward through that ad because I'm already engaged in something else. So that's why like the very beginning isn't great, because somebody's got their phone in their hands, real easy to fast forward. And then I always feel like, post-rolls serve their price. And, a lot of Geico and Progressive type advertisers, they're happy with that because they're like, hey, if I can get an impression, I got an impression, and they're not paying very much, overall for it. But the average advertiser, I don't personally think should run in a post-roll, because most people are not going to listen. Most people are not going to be like, oh, the podcast is over, but let me hang around and listen to this ad.
Yeah, let me hear that ad. I've been waiting for 30 minutes. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, since we have that baseline, Heather, when I was doing some research, one thing that jumped out to me about you is on your LinkedIn profile, you have podcast advertising done right. So that's big and bold on your LinkedIn header. So I was wondering, in your opinion, what do most brands get wrong when they look to advertise with podcasts?
There's a few things that they get wrong. So first, you really do need to make sure that you're targeting the right customer, right? So we don't want to advertise to someone who isn't going to be a good customer for your product. And my guess is that if you're in business, you've got a pretty good sense of who's buying from you. Oftentimes shows might look like from the outside like they could be a good fit for you, but you need to do your homework and dig in and make sure that that listener base is really going to be in the market to purchase your products or services. Podcast demographical information is not up to par with other digital marketing formats. And so it is very easy, depending on how you go about, structuring your campaign, for you to be like, I think that this audience could be right, but is it really? And so you need to make sure that you're, as an advertiser or an agency, getting that information from the host and digging in as much as you can to get that information. So targeting the right audience is really important. The other thing that I think happens is setting correct expectations. So podcast advertising is very different from other forms of marketing. When we look at digital advertising and social media advertising, there's all of that rich data that comes along with it, but there's also a lot of levers and a lot of opportunity for control, right? So if you wanted to open the floodgates up and say, today I want 1 million impressions with any form of digital or social, there's those opportunities where you really can get a lot of impressions. Now, of course, if you're going down the programmatic route, that works with podcasts too, but because most of the ads in the space are not run on that programmatic level at that mass, like, hey, I want to reach a whole bunch of people, I find that people have expectations that they're going to reach a ton of people today, right? So if you had a social media ad that went live today and you didn't have any traction at all, you would want to take a look and say, why am I not getting traction? Like, how come nobody clicked through? How come I didn't get any likes? How come I didn't get any engagement? And then you would really consider what was happening with the campaign. If that happened over a week, you would really dig into the campaign. What happens with podcast advertising is that people are so accustomed to that digital marketing that they think, hey, this show's got 100,000 downloads. I'm going to get some great impressions. And they are, but it takes a much longer period of time. So you have to come in with the expectation that podcast advertising is a slow moving medium. You, in most cases, are not going to start an ad today and see immediate traction. It's going to take some time to build that traction up. And really going into the campaign, setting those appropriate expectations is important. And then lastly, I would say a mistake that I see folks make is that they're not, I believe the best way to leverage podcast advertising is to view it as influencer marketing. So if you're able to identify hosts that you know will really like your product and speak to your product and add value, that influencer piece is going to be way more powerful than just general brand awareness, right? Or just getting your name out there. If you can find a host who is going to embrace your product, who is going to communicate all of the value of your product, there's so much there. And so I feel like that is something that podcasters get wrong, is that they aren't doing a good enough job of really partnering with the hosts and making sure the hosts realize that, hey, we're in this together. You know, I want you to understand and enjoy my product. And on the flip side, I want you to bring me customers. So what does that look like to try and create a partnership with them? It doesn't look like running 1 or 2 ads, right? Like, you do need to kind of dig in. And then I guess the other, I know I just said that was my last one, but the other one is you do need to monitor results as well. Yep. Because if you go into the campaign and you don't have a system in place of how are we going to measure success, what does success look like, then you're not going to know if it really did pan out to be what you wanted it to be, because you definitely should see traction. And if you're not getting any traction from a campaign, that means that a piece is broken somewhere.
Got it. Yeah. Some good takeaways there. And I want to go back to audience, because that's the one that you led with as far as a big mistake that you often see. And there is this sort of catch-22 here where you have a lot of opportunity with podcasts, but like you said, the level of detail with your listeners isn't there as it, compared to other forms of advertising. So how do you match that up? Is it, how do you dig deeper to understand someone's audience if they just have that demographic data? Is it actually understanding the host and some of their objectives and the theme around the show, or how do you get closer to what that audience is all about?
There are two ways that you can do it. So I think the first is to look at it from a very kind of matchy perspective. So for instance, I'm working with a client right now that has developed an app for moms. So it's very easy for them to say, I need to reach moms, right? So I can go through and I can say, I'm going to choose the mom podcast to advertise on. There's a lot of value in that, right? Because we know for sure who they're targeting is going to be their target market. The issue with that is that it doesn't scale super well. So if you're looking to come in and say, I really want podcast advertising to be a big lead generator for me, you're going to want to scale it. You're going to want to go somewhere bigger, right? So yes, starting out with those mom shows is a really good option, but then secondarily, we need to say, there are hundreds of thousands of other podcasts who reach my target demographic. And so then it is going to just purely demographical information. And I would say that in terms of getting that data, number one, Spotify has definitely grown their presence in the market. And say what you will about Spotify, good or bad, right, they do really provide some nice, easily accessible data about who is listening to your show. So if you as an advertiser are working with a podcast and you want to have a better understanding of who's listening, ask them to send you their Spotify data, because that's going to give you a really clear picture of who their audience is. Everybody has it. And if they're not on Spotify, you probably don't want to advertise with them. So, so I would say that's a really good, easy way of getting it. Next, a lot of podcasts do and should be doing surveys of their audiences, of just looking at, through this survey, who exactly is listening to my show. There's also Apple, does provide some statistics. I don't think they're as good as Spotify's are, but Apple provides some statistics. So as you're having conversations with podcasters, you do want to get into tell me about your listener. And then how do you know that this is your listener? So if you can actually get that screenshot of their Spotify data, you know for sure that there is no, they're not lying. That's who it is, right? So, yeah.
Got it. And then the other one that you mentioned was this partnership mentality, right? To take that route with podcasting. So I'm curious about, when is it a good time, or when is it a good fit for a technology company to pursue podcast advertising, whether that is more on that lower level, more niche based show like you mentioned with the application that was developed for moms, or do you go bigger and larger with a broader campaign? Like, when do you find the right time is to strike there?
It depends so much on the goals of the company. If you are looking for greater overall awareness, I do think programmatic is an easy way to scale in terms of just getting your company message out there. So there certainly are options, through companies like AdsWiz or obviously Spotify. So if you're looking to run a campaign that is programmatic, and what I mean by that is there's this level of targeting that happens that you can't do elsewhere. So depending on what your goals are, you might say, hey, we're a regional technology company and we just want to reach this region. That those programmatic ads are going to be the best for you because you can regionalize your buy. If you are feeling like you want to reach the entire country or the entire world, those can also be really good options because the reach is so great. And like I said, you do have this ability to deliver a lot of impressions in a shorter period of time. Whereas if you're looking to build individual relationships with podcasters, the investment monetarily is going to be lower, but you're going to have an investment of time and an investment in the relationship that you're building. So it really depends on the path that you're trying to take. If your company has seen success with influencer marketing, and I would say, in these cases, yeah, B2B definitely does work for sure because there's a ton of business podcasts out there, but I do think B2C works really well. So if you're a company that is focused, heavily in B2C, we do see a lot of direct to consumer brands that succeed in this space. And I think that crosses lines between technology and just, goods and services. So if you are looking to really leverage influencer marketing and you want to expand on that, that's when getting into those very specific niche shows makes sense, because you can get in there and you can really have that host be an ambassador for your product.
Yeah. And if you're going that route, so let's say, you're head of a small scrappy marketing team at a tech company, and you've made the decision like, hey, we are going to pilot some ads on podcasts. We're going to get this started. Like, what are the options in order to actually get that media buy in place? I mean, I know True Native Media is a podcast representation agency, but there are some other options as well. Self-serve, obviously, you've talked about some of that. And there might be going direct to the actual host of the podcast if it's a really small show and it's that niche audience that you're looking for. But what is that spectrum of opportunities companies have available to them?
Yeah, so there's a few different that I'll cover. So as you mentioned, you could go direct to the podcast. So we'll talk about what that looks like. You could go on a marketplace. So there's some marketplace options. You could work with a rep firm like True Native, or you could work with an agency. So I would say those are kind of the spectrum. If you're looking to go direct to the podcasters, that's a lot of work for you personally, right? Because you're going to have to identify the shows. You're going to have to find the contact information for those shows. You're going to have to do all of the heavy lifting. I'm not saying you should not do that. If there are specific shows that you really like, there can be great opportunity in you going directly to the show. And I would say if you go on the podcast website and they don't have any sort of contact information, if you listen to the show and you don't hear advertisers, I probably would just let it drop, because there definitely are shows out there that are not interested in advertising. You can waste a lot of time trying to track down somebody that's not even interested in running ads for you. So if you go to their website, they have very, clear contact information. If they have sponsorship information, that's a really good indication that they're going to want to work with you, right? So you could go direct. You could also go to marketplaces. And when I say marketplaces, I mean the online platforms where there are lots of different shows. So a few in this space are Advertise Cast is a big one. There's also Podcorn, that's a big one. There's also HeadGum, that's a big one. So if you go on these websites, you can choose from thousands of different shows, and it's a very automated process. So those are options. What I would say that in most cases, though, that is going to be very self-directed by you, the buyer. If you are spending enough, that platform would be happy to talk to you. So it just depends on what your budget is, if they're going to talk to you directly, or if you just have to go online and just place your buys. What I would say about the marketplaces that always is a bit unsettling to me is that the download numbers aren't necessarily confirmed very well. And so the host can go and they can post their show and they can say, I get 1 million downloads. And,
right.
There isn't, my guess is if they really said they were getting 1 million downloads, they probably would check up on that. But there isn't a lot of checks and balances in terms of like audience size. And so that always makes me a bit nervous. So I definitely think if you were going to go the marketplace route, I feel like I would message them and say, hey, can you confirm, like, I want screenshots from these shows of like their stats. The other option, like you mentioned, True Native Media, the company that I founded, is a podcast representation firm. So we work with about 70 different shows, and our role is to connect advertisers with those shows. Granted, those 70 shows are going to be within specific genres. So if you came to me, let's say, and said, I want a karate podcast, well, we don't work with any karate podcasts, so we couldn't help you. Representation firms are going to have kind of a selection of different podcasts that you can buy. And I feel like they're a good in between for the marketplace and going direct, because you get a level of personalized service. You get somebody who's going to help you create a campaign and help you, try to make sure that that's a successful campaign. And you're not having to individually reach out to all the shows. And then lastly, depending on the size of your budget, I would say if you have like over 150,000 that you're wanting to invest, then I would recommend that you go directly to a podcast ad buying agency. So some of the top agencies out there are Veritone, Ad Results, Oxford Road, and those companies literally work with everyone in the industry. So you could go to them and say, these are the type of shows I want. They can put a really comprehensive plan together for you. They've got really good tracking mechanisms in place. They do all center, I would say, very strongly on direct response. So they're direct response agencies. So if that's what you're looking for, those companies are a good fit.
Got it. And I noticed on your website, so if we talk about the representation piece, since that's typically the one that you lead, I saw on your website, you broke down the process into really 3 steps. So can you talk about like initially, what is that first phase that you go through? How do you set up a client to properly execute a podcast advertising campaign?
Yeah, like I had mentioned before, really it's about identifying first and foremost what the goals are of the advertiser. So, if somebody came to me and said, hey, I am looking to get 200 new customers in the next 2 months, how can we do that? That's going to be a very different conversation from, hey, we already have brand recognition. We already know that this segment of the market is very aware of who we are, and we're just looking to create more awareness. And yeah, we want conversions too, right? Which both of those happen. So it really depends on the goals that you have set. And based on those goals, then we're going to execute on the campaign. So we would start with those goals. Next, we would move to, of course, your target demographic, who it is that you're looking to reach. Of course, we would consider budget because budget is a big consideration. And then we would move into the planning phase of, okay, which shows are going to be best. And for us, it's important. We go through and we vet all of our shows to make sure that they want to advertise this product or service. And I am surprised by the number of podcasters who turn down advertisers. Really does happen more than you might think. Before I got into podcast advertising, I had been in other forms of advertising. If a company walked in the door, as long as there were no government restrictions on them advertising, we would take their money.
Yeah.
Yeah. But really, podcast hosts have worked very hard to build an audience and to build trust with their audience. And what I have found is that if the host looks at your company and feels like it's maybe shady in any way, or maybe, your product doesn't reflect the caliber of the show that they have, they'll say no, so that does happen. So we go through this vetting process with the host to make sure that they are interested. And then of course, when we have all of those wrapped up, then we go ahead and launch the campaign.
All right. And Heather, if we go back to, just preparing for the campaign in the early stages, you mentioned budget is a big consideration. And you said earlier, it's good to go out to some of these other larger agencies if you have that $100,000 threshold in place, right? If you're looking to make that investment. So if we're not going that route and we're either doing self-serve or we're perhaps using a representation agency, what do those budgets look like? What's the range that we should understand there?
Yeah, one of the nice things about podcasts is that there is a big range that you could spend. My opinion is that if you advertise on shows that are too small, you're really not going to get much traction. So I don't recommend advertising on podcasts where you're reaching less than 10 to 20,000 impressions in a month. I just don't think that there's enough there to really see traction. Again, unless it's something super specific. I worked with a podcast several years ago now that was government contracting podcast, right? So they just created content for government contractors, which is a super difficult audience to reach. I want to say they were getting 5,000 downloads. That was fine, right? Because it was such a targeted audience. So depending on the type of technology company you are, you may have a very specific, target customer. And if that's the case, I would probably truthfully kind of throw size out the window. I still don't think that I would advertise on a show that was getting maybe less than 1,000 downloads per episode, because you just want to make sure that you've got that critical mass, right? So pricing should definitely be dictated by the size of the audience. as well as the type of the content that they're creating and the audience that they're reaching. So again, if you have this very selective, I'm reaching government contractors, I need one contract to bring in a $500,000 deal, you're going to pay more for that ad than like, I have an app and installations are $5, right? You're going to need to have way more conversions to make it make sense. So in terms of budgeting, it can be all over the board. I would say that our threshold is a $5,000 minimum buy. And usually I tell starting advertisers that somewhere between, I would say 5 and 10 is a good place to start. I think if you have less than that, if you're really trying to make, if you're really trying to see some results from the campaign, get some traction, you really do need to make sure you're investing enough, because you're going to want to run some compare, tests, right? You're going to want to split test it in some ways, and maybe split test isn't the right word, but you're definitely going to want to advertise on enough podcasts so that you can say, this one worked super well. We like this one. We're going to be back. This one, not so much, because when you are talking about that influencer space, there are some hosts that are just going to do better, right? They're going to do better ad reads. There's going to be more authenticity within their ad read. They're going to have more engaged audiences, and you're not going to know right up front. So you're going to want to invest enough so that you can see where the successes are and where the failures are.
Got it. And Heather, you as somewhat of a matchmaker, right? You're trying to work with these brands, and you're pairing them up with traditionally a host read ad that, they want this brand on their show as well. And there's kind of, that intersection, minds have come together, so to speak. How does it work? Is it strictly like, how do those partnerships work as far as executing the ads themselves? Do you find that the host will go off some guidelines from the brand, or, how do you actually, once the handshake is in place, you have budget, how does the creative actually get in place there?
Yeah. So one thing that I didn't mention that I should have before is it's very, very important to make sure that the host is willing to try out your product, right? So you want to make sure that they're actually going to get in and use it. And in some cases, let's say you are a company that does like money transferring, maybe like a PayPal type, maybe you're not going to have them use your product because it just doesn't make sense. But if you're able to have the host actually use the product that you've created, that makes a huge difference, because they're going to be able to really speak to the ad and to the product from a very authentic, firsthand experience type of way. So first, really, really do everything you can to make sure that they try your product. And then you're going to want to give the host what we call talking points. So the ad shouldn't be scripted, right? You don't want to give them a script, but you do want to give them some guidelines. And I always look to what is that unique selling proposition that you have created. Make sure that they have that. Make sure that they know what sets you apart, from your competitors. If that's a big deal, like, hey, this is what we do and this is why we're amazing. So typically what you're going to want is the host to start out by saying, hey, my inbox has been overflowing for the last 10 years, and I just installed, Email Express, and now my inbox is beautiful, right? So you want them to start by talking about the experience they've had with the product, but then you want them to get down to the brass tacks about your company and why your company is actually different, or again, what that unique selling proposition is. And you need to provide the host with that, right? Because they're not going to know what to say. So make sure that you provide them with that. And then you do want to also make sure that you're providing them with some sort of a call to action. So that, and I really encourage people, and I know it's difficult to come up with interesting, exciting offers, but one of the pet peeves I have is when I'm working with a company and they're like, my offer's free shipping. I'm like, really? Because when I go on your site, it says free shipping everywhere. How is that special, right? So you want to create something that's going to motivate somebody to actually take action. So have a strong call to action and try to make sure it's not something that's like a pop-up on your homepage. And then you want to provide some sort of a tracking mechanism. So if it's a promo code, if it's a landing page, if it's, a unique URL, however you want to set it up, but people are very accustomed to go to expressemail.com/Tristan to get your first month free or whatever it is. So make sure that you have, a very specific call to action and a way for you to track those conversions.
Okay. So Heather, once we have these ads in place, I have my $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 budget, right? I'm piloting this campaign. How do you report on this on your side? Like, how does that work downstream? How do you evaluate the campaign?
So a few things to consider. There is attribution tracking that is in the space. And if you are able to set that up, I would highly recommend it. The company that we work most closely with is a company called Pod Sites, and it's SIGHT, Pod Sites. And what they do is they just use tracking pixels, right? So if you're in marketing, you'll have used a pixel before. And if you are able to get that pixel installed on your site, I always recommend that you put it on your checkout page so you can see what kind of actual conversions are taking place. But Pod Sites allows you to look at who has listened to the podcast and then who is converting. So if you can set up attribution tracking, there's Pod Sites, there's other companies like Chartable or Barometric that do a similar service. Set that up because that's going to allow you to really see what is working. So if you can do that, do that. Next, I would definitely look at those conversions that are just coming through that unique URL or the promo code. As long as you're really clear about the action that you want them to take. Did you want them to sign up for your newsletter? Were you looking for installations? Like, what are you looking for, right? So then you can track that action that's taking place. And then in terms of really looking at the podcast, you do want to know what kind of impressions you're getting based on what you were promised. So if you're doing a baked in or embedded ad, we can't really tell you for sure how many impressions you received, but we can look at how many downloads that podcast received. So in a 30 to 45 day period, you should get a report from that show saying like, hey, this episode got 10,000 downloads. We thought it was going to get 15, but it got 10 or whatever, right? Or maybe it got 20 and we thought it was going to get 15. But get that number from the host because that'll give you some idea. If you're doing dynamic or programmatic, you'll get like an impression, like that impression number is easier to deliver, but then you should get that impression number of how many people actually heard the ad.
All right. And along the way, I know you have a lot of experience setting up these partnerships, right? Like, have you ever come across a situation or maybe describe for me a scenario where you felt that this campaign was really going to work, but it just kind of fell flat? Like, what's an example? Give me some war stories here.
Oh, sure. Oh, you want my war stories? That's fun. I don't know if I've had anybody ask me that. I would say the biggest war story I have was an eyeglass company. So if you're familiar with Warby Parker, Parker is a big advertiser in the podcast space. They don't spend as much as they used to, but a lot of times brands will enter the space, spend a lot in podcasts, and then make enough to then move on to TV or a bigger medium. Warby Parker's big advertiser in this space. So we were approached by an eyeglass company that I was like, this is perfect. Warby Parker obviously does super well in this space. This eyeglass company should do super well in this space. We put together a really good campaign for them. And I really had high hopes that it was going to succeed, and it did not. It definitely fell flat. And retrospectively, there were a few things that took place that really, I would say, hurt the campaign. So the first one was that at the very end of the campaign, which would have been so nice if they had told me at the beginning of the campaign, they let me know that frames were actually not their big seller, that contacts were.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they were selling frames. So we were marketing frames, we were promoting frames in the ads, but yet contacts were a bigger product for them. And I was like, why were we not advertising contacts instead of frames? So that was a big mistake. The second mistake that we made was that the promo codes that they set up were case sensitive. Oh. And so they set them up as being all uppercase. And I was like, why? Why would you do that? I didn't know that they were case sensitive.
Yeah.
We just kept getting messages like the promo codes aren't working. Like, why? The host would be like, my audience is telling me the promo code's not working. And then we would go in and we would be like, why is the promo code not working, you guys? And they would say, it's working fine on our end. Well, then we discovered that it was a case sensitive issue. And so I was like, okay, make sure that they're all like not case sensitive. And then lastly, they were looking to run a direct response campaign, but they were a high-end, non-discount type retailer. So what they were doing is that they were taking tactics that are used from a discount retailer, and they were trying to apply them for a high-end type of company, right? And so they were like, hey, we don't do discounts. That's not our thing. And what was happening is we were getting feedback from the hosts that their audience were going online and they were like, oh my gosh, these glasses are like $600 a piece. Like, where is the discount? Like, and they're really like their call to action and their offer was really bad because they didn't normally discount things. And so you can't try to create a direct response campaign if you're not going to have a motivator to get people to come over and take an action. And so if you are not a discounter, and granted, I know we're talking to technology companies here, and yeah, maybe you don't need to discount things super heavily. I mean, in technology, it's not, there are obviously tactics that you know about your company and how to attract people. But if you are looking to get people to come, you're going to have a strong call to action. And if you don't have that, there's going to be issues. And then I do think that because they were such a high-end retailer, we were reaching audiences that were looking for Warby Parker prices, and they were not getting those. And so there was a mismatch between the audience and the product.
Which goes back to one of the first things that you mentioned at the top, why sub campaigns fail or what companies get wrong is that audience piece, right? It's just a big part of it. And on the flip side, Heather, walk us through something that may have surprised you, like where you just felt like someone had a product and you weren't sure if you were going to be able to find a match, but it seemed like that they hit it on the mark and it's working for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that we've had a lot of success with different like online banking tools. They really seem like they work super well. I would say software companies in particular work really well on podcast advertising. And truthfully, from the very beginning, that has kind of surprised me that people really are that interested. But I think it has a lot to do with the fact, and it's changing as podcasting grows, but podcast listeners do still tend to be a bit of that early adopter. And we've had some, like I said, getting back to like the online banking, we've had some online banking companies that have just done exceptionally well. And what I love is when the advertiser is really happy with the results, but the podcast host is also happy, right? Mm-hmm. So when they're getting positive feedback that their audience likes the service that they're advertising, and they're saying like, my audience is messaging me and saying, thank you for recommending this because I really like this, product. And then on the flip side, the advertiser is super happy because they're seeing the conversions that they want. So yeah.
All right. And last question here for you, Heather. If I am, in that seat, I'm leading this marketing team, small team, how should I think about podcast advertising in comparison to some other options that are available to me? Like, what is really great about podcast advertising versus some of the other things that are out there?
Not to beat a dead horse, but I really do feel like it's that influencer piece. What's so amazing about podcasting is the ability for the listener to create a mental picture about what is being discussed. I go back to when I was a kid, my dad used to listen to Paul Harvey, which was an AM radio host. And he would come home at lunch, my dad, and sit down and eat his lunch, and he would listen to Paul Harvey. And as you're listening to Paul Harvey, you get this picture in your mind about what does Paul Harvey look like? And he used to do host read ads. He would talk about different products. And in your mind, you're creating this mental picture. That mental picture is so much more powerful than someone serving me up a video or a social media ad or a banner ad, right? Just the things that pop up, because those feel so intrusive. No one asked for that ad to come up. And I feel like sometimes even like with YouTube, like I'll start watching a YouTube video, I'll look at the ad and I'll be like, why is this ad here? Right. And then, sometimes you get sucked in and you're like, wait, why am I watching this ad? I can skip, because even though sometimes I'm interested, it feels intrusive. And I'm not saying that podcast ads aren't intrusive, right? Nobody out there is asking for more advertising, right. But when you've got a host that like, and trust as a listener, and they bring you a product, there's this level of confidence that happens along with that, that mental picture that I was talking about that really makes you say, oh, well, gosh, if this person likes this product, I should check it out. And it's amazing when you look at the number of people that say that they've actually purchased a product or a service. I think like 68% of podcast listeners say that they've purchased something that they heard about advertised on a podcast. And so there's this relationship element and this relationship building that happens. And I have had advertisers tell me that they get better quality customers from podcast ads than other forms. So they're customers that are going to stay, there's staying power with these customers because of the process that it takes to get to the place where you're listening to that podcast and engaging. If they're going to come over and they're going to purchase your product, they're going to be a different caliber of customer than somebody that's like, just maybe like, oh yeah, I'm just going to try that out real quick. Right. So I really believe that those are some of the values that podcasts bring.
Yeah, and with that better quality, you're probably going to have to sacrifice some of that attribution, right? Because like that scenario that you just mentioned where someone talked about where they heard about the product, it's really hard to attribute that back to a URL or something, or a coupon code that you entered when you signed up for the software. So all those things have to be, I think, taken into account as well. And traditionally, if someone is closely aligned to that host and like you said, they know, like, and trust them, it goes along with those ads too that are in place. So it works kind of hand in hand there. Well, Heather, I think that's a good spot to stop there. It's a great primer for some of our customers that have been asking about podcast advertising, and this was a big help for me as well. Final thing on your side, where can people go to find out more about you and True Native Media?
Yeah, for sure. If you're interested in learning more about podcast advertising, I would send you to our podcast. So my show is called the Podcast Advertising Playbook. And on the show, we really try to get into how to create campaigns, how to make them successful. We interview companies who have done a lot of podcast ad buying and look at what they've done to be successful. So I would definitely recommend that you go and check that out. And then I'm really active on LinkedIn. So if you just go to LinkedIn and search for Heather Osgood, I'll come up. But that's my favorite social platform. And if you have questions, feel free to head on over there. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Awesome. Well, Heather, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content. I'll probably see you on LinkedIn coming up soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.